Yeah, so it's going. Okay, it's
Very good.
being recorded. Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cool.
Yes, you may say a few words at the beginning if you want, and then we have. You said we would have 1 hour, right? Approximately
Yeah, we
half an
have
hour.
1 hour for the whole session, so like I think like 35 minutes for the presentation. So then
Yeah.
we have some time for questions. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, not sure what kind of questions they may be, but like during the meeting with Ambassador, there were very interesting questions from people. So I think it will be great.
Very good. Very good. Excellent.
Perfect then. I will then go maybe around, check if
Yes,
there are
please.
people coming, and
Yeah, sure.
Hey, thank you, Professor, for your patience. I think we will start, and maybe other people will join in the meantime. So it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Sülü Havarum, Professor of Ecclesiology, International Relations, and Ecumenism. He will talk about just and sustainable peace for Ukraine. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me with you. It is an honor and pleasure to be a part of this conversation. I'm sorry that I can't be with you physically, even though I'm supposed to be in Sweden now. But at the moment I'm in Rome and I'm talking from Rome. In my presentation today, which I'm on screen so you can follow it easier. So in my presentation today, I will be talking about civil society as the most important agent of resilience and transformations in Ukraine. It was formed primarily through the people's uprisings called Maidans in 1990, 2003, 2004, and finally 2013 and 2014. Vladimir Putin considered them as a threat to his regime and waged a war which escalated in February 2022. This war has become the ultimate test for Ukraine's political agency, and the country seems to be passing this test. Both the Kremlin and some Western intellectuals surprisingly converge in diminishing this agency. And I'm going to be critical about this tendency in my presentation. They sometimes present the war as a Western infringement upon Russia and a conflict, so to say, that the West wants to continue until, as some people say, the last Ukrainian. Such an interpretation of the war feeds political populism across the globe, and we see how we can observe right now how the messages propelled by the Russian propaganda are popping up in different countries. Like recently it was Slovakia, where a new government, a new prime minister was elected with quite pro-Russian agenda and rhetoric, which resonates with what I'm going to talk. We see the same in the United States with some Republicans repeating the points of the Russian propaganda. Even Elon Musk is not immune to that propaganda and posts and translates some of its points. So it's important to understand, to look at the Ukraine situation from the point of agency in order to avoid this sort of manipulations and this sort of propaganda. This propaganda is false and it ignores its most important factor, the Ukrainian people's resolution to end the war on its own terms. The people's agency must be respected by any peacemaking initiative for Ukraine. And there are, as you know, there are many talks about the formula of peace for Ukraine. And I believe that the Ukraine agency should be at the core, in the very core of any equation of peace for Ukraine. This agency is a condition sine qua non for just and sustainable peace, which is my main claim in this presentation. Let me start with some stories. In mid-July 2023, I was on a humanitarian mission, which drew me to the southern front line of the war in Ukraine. I was invited by a group of evangelical Christians. Originally from Mariupol, they fled the city when the Russian forces occupied it. Before 2022, this group took care of Mariupol's homeless children and adults, many with histories of addiction. The group's leader, Pastor Gennady Mokhnenko, has adopted 36 children, most of them homeless, in addition to 3 biological children of his own. After the occupation of Mariupol, Gennady and his fellows re-established themselves in Zaporizhia, which is in the south of Ukraine. They refocused their activities on something different from what they did in Mariupol. They have grouped themselves to what they called the Chaplaincy Battalion Mariupol. It is not really a battalion or any other military unit, even though they wear uniform. It is more like a mobile ecclesial community that begins its way with prayers and then splits into smaller groups and deliver food, water, medicaments, and other supplies to both Ukrainian military units and civilians located as close to the front line as within a couple of kilometers from the Russian positions. And here you can see a picture when I visited this battalion, chaplaincy battalion, and this is a morning reflection, kind of morning prayer and reflection that they have before going to positions and before distributing the humanitarian aid to various groups. On July 13, 2023, I joined one of those tiny groups and went to the town of Orikhiv. It was never occupied by the Russians, but since the spring 2022, it has been in the proximity of the front line, completely exposed to Russian shelling. As a result, almost all buildings in the town have been either damaged or destroyed. In 2020, its population was about 15,000 people. Less than 10% remain now. Most of them are elderly. Many of them were deprived of electricity, running water, and other basic facilities for over a year. Some time ago, a humanitarian hub was set up where they could come and receive hot food, have a shower, or even watch TV. A few days before I came to Orikhiv, Russian airplanes dropped 2 bombs and destroyed the hub, together with those who had come to receive some help there. About a dozen people died and more were wounded. Most of them volunteers and elderly people. The same pattern as you can observe in the recent days, when yesterday there was a bombardment of a funeral service in a village of Groza in the east of Ukraine, when over 50 people were killed by a Russian bomb, by a Russian actual missile, Iskander missile. And today there was a bombardment of Kharkiv in the east of Ukraine again, and again many people died, including children, as a result of this bombardment. So it's a very usual thing. And when I came to Orikhiv, the bombardment happened just a couple of days before, and the wounds were very fresh. When we were standing at the ruins, a gentleman in his early 70s approached and told us that he now comes to the spot every day to mourn his friend hit by the bomb. In the time of peace, he told us, he had organized a photo club. Now, when most of its members left the town, he uses his photo skills to document destructions. He showed us on his camera the bodies of the victims of the bombardment. And that's what we've seen, what we saw on the spot of this humanitarian aid. It was completely destroyed, as you can see, and a dozen of people were buried under the debris. We also visited the place where some of the destroyed hub's clients live. The 3-story apartment house is at the town's side facing the Russian positions. From there, they are being shelled on almost everyday basis. A Russian cannon had delivered a mine precisely to the door of their building during the breakfast time the day before we came. This makes it suicidal to stay in the apartments. Less suicidal is to stay at the house's basement, where they moved more than a year ago. I have been to many places of misery, such as the favelas of Rio de Janeiro and the slums of Uganda. Even the barracks of Auschwitz, in my judgment, look more comfortable than the living conditions of the babushkas hiding at the basement underneath the apartments in Orikhiv. Members of this group, the oldest of them in her advanced 80s, most of their time spent surrounded by concrete walls without daylight or ventilation. They do not have electricity or running water or sewage. In addition to that, as I mentioned, they are being ceaselessly bombarded by the Russians. And this is the condition they live in. It's a dorm in the basement where they sleep. They've been sleeping there since March 2022, essentially. I could not resist asking these people, why do they choose to stay in this basement? They have a choice to go to Zaporizhia or even abroad. Social workers and volunteers urged them many times to leave for a safe place. Yet they told me there is no way they would do so. They absolutely resolved to stay as close as possible to their homes, whatever it takes, even death itself. I was first puzzled by this response, their response, but then I realized that is a metaphor for Ukraine. My country, in a similar way, did not yield to the overwhelming and seemingly unstoppable Russian forces advancing upon Kiev and planning taking over it within 3 days. The Ukrainians who have picked up the fight, which seemed unwinnable, and continue fighting regardless of the price, are like these elderly people in Orikhiv. They have been urged to give up many times, and yet they are resolved to carry on. If someone disagrees with their decision, we still must respect it, as I respected the decision of these elderly people, because it is their free choice based on rational arguments and moral judgments. That's how we had a conversation with these people in the basement. Ukraine emerged from the Soviet yoke with a very limited experience of freedom and self-determination. Joseph Stalin, and before him the Romanovs, made sure that the Ukrainians have forgotten the traditions of self-governance and decision-making, which they had in the period of the Cossack Republic in Zaporizhia, in the period of early modernity, before they became incorporated into the Russian Empire. The strongest blow to the Ukrainian longing for freedom was the artificial famine, Holodomor, in the early 30s. Then the Kremlin created conditions that led to starvation and eventual death of up to 7 million Ukrainians, mostly in the rural areas. Many of them were bearers of strong will and agency for political social action, which Stalin wanted to eradicate. This is our conversation with the journalists from Africa. There was a group of journalists from Africa when we visited together the monument to the victims of Holodomor in Kyiv this summer. They came to cover the grain export crisis in Ukraine, because all those grain crops, they go to Africa, many of them, and this conversation with the journalists happened in the days when Putin decided to cease to stop its what they call grain deal, allowing the Ukrainians to export their grains. The Soviet dictator Stalin managed this, but not completely. Since the independent Ukrainian state was established in 1991, the Ukrainian weakened political agency and responsibility has been growing exponentially. This growth featured several important milestones, which the Ukrainians usually refer to as the Maidans. Maidan is an abbreviated nickname for the central square of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. In the beginning of the Soviet period, this square was called Soviet, and in its end, of the October Revolution. After the Ukrainian independence, it was renamed to the square in Ukrainian Maidan of Independence. It became the epicenter of all Ukrainian uprisings, which the Ukrainians like to call revolutions. The earliest of them was the so-called Revolution on Granite. It took place in October 1990 and was driven by a group of students. They went on hunger strike and stayed in tents pitched on the main Kyiv square granite pavement, hence is the revolution's name. In its culminating point, it brought together dozens of thousands of protesters. They tried to prevent reestablishing the Soviet Union through signing a new agreement between the Soviet republics. Instead, they wanted their country to become independent and de-Sovietized. At that time, I was in high school and participated in similar manifestations in my own city of Cherkasy in central Ukraine. I remember this feeling of being a part of a group which, albeit small, can incur a lot of change. After many years, I would describe this feeling as an awoken awareness of our own agency. By us, a posteriori, I mean the nuclei of the nascent civil society, which would become the strongest player on the Ukrainian political scene. Next time, I had the same strong feeling 14 years later, during the revolution, which was called Orange. It was the color of the presidential campaign of Viktor Yushchenko, with whom most of the Ukrainian civil society identified themselves and their hopes for democratic change. His contender was Viktor Yanukovych, who was associated with corruption and regress, demonstrated distinct Soviet mentality, and advocated for closer ties with Russia. In the presidential elections in November 2004, the Central Election Committee of Ukraine gave Yanukovych the win. However, there was a consensus shared by most international observers and progressive Ukrainian public that the commission manipulated the results. Up to 1 million poured to the square Maidan of independence in Kiev, as well as central squares and streets in other Ukrainian cities. As a result, Ukraine's Supreme Court ordered to redo voting. This time it was declared as fair and awarded Yushchenko with presidency. I took this picture at the time of the Orange Revolution when I was there. That year, I defended my PhD thesis at Durham University, and sometime earlier had started working in Moscow at the Department for External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate. I was full of ideas that I brought from Britain, where I discovered the power of civil society and learned to appreciate democracy. I saw similar manifestations of people's own agency in the streets and squares of Kiev, where I visited my family. One time, I visited Kiev with my colleague from the Moscow Patriarchate. I observed that his attitude to what he saw in Kiev during and soon after the Orange Revolution was different from mine. He looked at it with some suspicion. He clearly showed that he did not appreciate the agency of the people. Later on, he would become one of the key designers of the Russian world ideology, which acknowledges the agency of the state only. This ideology wants the people's agency to be limited to following exclusively the will of the political leaders. If citizens dare to diverge from what the government says, they are either manipulated or deluded, or both. So the proponents of the Russian world believe. In November 2004, when the protests against the rigged elections started, the wife of Viktor Yanukovych, Lyudmila Yanukovych, held a public speech, which became viral. I quote her speaking, "Dear friends, I'm just from Kiev." She apparently saw this scene that I took a picture of. "So I'm just from Kiev. I can tell you what is going on there. There is an orange coven there, so there are booths in rows, and everything is American everywhere, and mountains of oranges. It's a nightmare. And I want to tell you that these oranges are not simple, but pricked. People take an orange, eat, and then take another one, and their hands on their own stretch to take another orange, and they stand and they stand. Their eyes are just crazy." So it's like a conspiracy theory of that day to explain the Maidan, that people just took oranges which were pricked with some substances that made them manipulated. In a nutshell, the message that Yanukovych and his confederates wanted to deliver was the following: those who dare to protest do not do this by their own decision. They are either drugged or manipulated or bribed, or all of them. Viktor Yanukovych and his cronies could not imagine that people could come to the Maidan by their own will. Among many explanations about the origins of such a perception, one is theological. In his native Donbass, Yanukovych began his career as a criminal who turned to a politician. When he already reached some political prominence in his region, he converted to Orthodox Christianity. His conversion happened under the influence of a renowned monk, Zosima Sakur, who became Yanukovych's spiritual mentor of sorts. Zosima's peculiar spiritual practices and ideas included a complete disbelief in human agency. At the same time, he believed in coercion as the only effective means of achieving the ideals of Christian life. He was also completely anti-Western, anti-ecumenical, and a fervent proponent of the Ukraine's unity with Russia. He said, for example, I quote him, "This is what our Rus was like, one mighty indivisible. This is how it should be for the future generations, inseparable, so that there would be no this Ukraine, Russia, so that it could unite all of us, so that we would be a single spiritual family." The ideas of coercion and unity with Russia helped Yanukovych to consolidate his power and cultivate autocracy and corruption. Quasi-theological ideals of his spiritual mentor, Zosima, planted in his mind this belief in the society's own agency. The same disbelief has been planted in Vladimir Putin's mind. The Russian leader also has spiritual mentors who believe in coercion and Holy Rus. They include the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill Gundyaev, and Metropolitan of Pskov and Porkhov, Tikhon Shevkunov. Both are the main providers of religion-based ideology of Putin's regime. At the same time, Tikhon's worldview is closer to that of Zosima. The former often refers to the latter and shares his conspiracy theories that the global West ostensibly seeks to destroy Russia. Tikhon also actively promotes coercion in both spiritual and political life. His best-selling book, Everyday Saints and Other Stories, endorses coercion as the most effective method of mission, which God himself prefers, according to him. Human agency in the book and the worldview of Tikhon is reduced to a minimum. He reportedly advises Putin on various policies, which helps him to pass his ideas and theories to the Russian president and his circles. Those ideas and theories fall to the well-prepared soil. As a KGB agent, Putin was trained to distrust human agency and to identify either real or imagined manipulations behind political and social developments. The more absolute power he accumulated, the more his distrust developed into paranoia. Apparently, a progressing paranoia regarding the growing agency of the Ukrainian civil society constituted a factor that influenced Putin's attitude to the events that developed in Ukraine during the winter of 2013-14. Those events became known as the Revolution of Dignity, or Euromaidan. It was triggered by President Yanukovych's refusal to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. Instead, he declared that his priority would be to tighten Ukraine's relations with Russia. Not only this, but also the galloping corruption and multiple violations of human rights under Yanukovych's presidency urged hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in Kyiv and other cities across the country to join the protests. Ukraine's main square, the Maidan, again became their epicenter. My personal experience with the Euromaidan was not much different from the experiences of 1990 or 2004. People rose up and began acting with determination and assuredness about their own agency against all the odds of the circumstances. This time, however, the circumstances were significantly harsher than earlier. It was winter with temperatures falling far below 0 Celsius. Then there were special police units, especially the famous Berkut. They circumfused the protesters with water guns under below 0 temperatures, which is prohibited by international regulations. Organized bands of gangsters to beat those who returned from the Maidan home, kidnapped people, of whom some were killed in the forests around Kyiv. The governmental violence culminated in February 2014 when snipers and other units started shooting and killing the protesters. 108 were killed. Later, they were proclaimed the members of the so-called Heavenly Hundred. Over 1,100 were wounded. This was the hardest test so far for the resilience and self-determination agency of the Ukrainian society. It had to resist not only the troops sent by Yanukovych, but also some Western mediators who tried to bring the Maidan's representatives to the table with Yanukovych. The Maidan, in its majority, booed such attempts. Eventually, everyone complied with the will of the protesters, including Yanukovych, who fled the country. I took this picture in the aftermath of the Maidan. It's from Kyiv. That's how the Maidan looked like after the Maidan won. Vladimir Putin, however, did not see the victory of the Maidan as a manifestation of the people's will. He read it as a success of the Western manipulations behind the scenes. The Russian propaganda began disseminating narratives that confirmed such an interpretation of the events. For example, a popular conspiracy theory was propelled that the protesters at the Maidan were drugged. It was not much different from how Lyudmila Yanukovych had explained the Orange Revolution 10 years before. This time, however, not oranges but cookies appeared to be in the center of the anti-Maidan propaganda. The story goes like this. On December 11, 2013, a representative of the United States Department of State, Victoria Nuland, accompanied by the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, visited the camp of the protesters at the Maidan of Independence in Kiev. During their visit, they shared with the people gathered there some sandwiches and pies. The Russian propaganda immediately turned them to cookies infused with drugs that paralyzed the will of those who eat them. In other words, it did not give the Ukrainian people a chance to exercise their own will and agency. It was all drugs. As a true believer in coercion as the only means that can effectively change people's mind, Vladimir Putin waged a proxy war against Ukraine immediately following the victory of the Revolution of Dignity. He annexed Crimea and then sent his Green Man without military insignia to the Donbas area in the east of Ukraine. The war began, and it had not yet ended yet, as we know. In February 2022, it just escalated. From February 2014 through February 2022, according to the Ukrainian reports, over 3,400 civilians and over 4,600 Ukrainian military were killed. And this is the memorial wall in Kiev. It's a wall of a monastery, St. Michael's Monastery, which is used as a wall to put on the portraits of all the victims of the war. Nevertheless, the Western reactions to the Russian intervention in 2014 were lukewarm. The US and EU introduced sanctions against the Russian economy, which were more decorative. Through the Minsk agreements, they tried to force Ukraine to accept the formula peace in exchange for territories. In the meantime, they kept striking sweet deals with Russia, such as notorious Nord Stream pipeline for Russian gas. Like in the case of the early Maidans, the will and strong agency of the Ukrainian people were the main driving force that resisted the Russian aggression. Strong agency helped the Ukrainians to resist the overwhelming Russian military forces after February 24. Ukraine's partners had no hope, most of them, that it would survive the invasion. Yet, the miracle happened. My explanation for this miracle is the civil society, which is aware of its potentiality and self-determination. It had matured during the previous Maidans and reached its highest point during the Russian invasion. More than 3 decades of the recent Ukrainian history demonstrate a strong resolution of the Ukrainian people to protect themselves and their democracy. Each time that the pressure increased, the resolution grew only stronger. It seems to be stronger than the will of the West to help Ukraine, even though the Western solidarity has increased dramatically since February 2022. Although the Ukrainian army, supported by the army of volunteers and the West, has contained Russian advances and significantly weakened his army, Vladimir Putin and his propaganda machine still present this war with the Ukrainian agency almost completely neglected. According to the Kremlin, the war has been provoked by the West, particularly the NATO, and the Ukrainians are just a bail for the Western neo-imperial advances against the Holy Rus. The Russian propaganda presents Russia and not Ukraine as the victim of aggression, while Ukraine is just a passive instrument. Surprisingly, many of even those in the West who sincerely support Ukraine still buy into and retell these narratives. Quite a few secular intellectuals and religious leaders across the globe would agree to one or another degree with the formula that the West fights against Russia to the last Ukrainian. This formula was coined by the proponents of the war. For example, the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, as early as in April 2022, accused the United States of the intention to fight it until the last Ukrainian. Some days later, these words were repeated by Noam Chomsky, the famous American, or rather anti-American intellectual. In a surprising move, Russia and quite a few Western policymakers and intellectuals like Chomsky converge in seeing the war as a chess game. For them, the Ukrainians are just pawns on the board. Their will, resolution, and agency do not matter. Nothing can be more unfair to the people who every day make a choice to sacrifice their life and health for the sake of their own freedom and the freedom of those who value it in the world. Therefore, any scenario of peace for Ukraine should be based on what the Ukrainian society decides to do about its own future. During the Maidans, this society demonstrated its maturity in judgments and its resolution to sacrifice anything for the sake of freedom. The Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, also demonstrates his understanding of how important Ukrainian agency is. Many politicians in the West have demonstrated the same understanding. There should be a complete consensus on this matter among those who stand for Ukraine and want to help Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that interesting and thorough presentation. And I see that we have one question on the chat first. Could religion help to heal the wounds of war, both within Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia? Or will it rather make it harder, taking into account what all you said about the Russian bishops, their religious national theories? What do you think?
Well, religion certainly can help. It reminds me somehow of the situation in Europe 70 or 80 years ago, when the regimes like fascism and Nazism in Europe, and actually it was not just Italian or German fascism and Nazism, there were other fascisms in Europe, across Europe at the time. Like the Vichy regime in France, like the dictatorship of Metaxas in Greece, in Romania, the regime of Antonescu and others. So at that time, religion actually contributed to strengthening those regimes. Religion was a part that supported many Christians, most Christians, I would say, like in Germany, for example. They supported Nazism in different ways, like there were Deutsche Christians who were very active in supporting the Nazis. There were Christians who were kind of lukewarm. They passively supported the Nazis. There was, of course, a tiny but still powerful faction within the German Christianity that was against the Nazis. They produced the famous Bormann Declaration. But anyways, Christianity was a part of the problem. I mean, in most European countries. And with the end of the World War II, with the collapse of the totalitarian regimes, Christian churches really changed their standing. They, well, repented. Most of them repented for what they had done in supporting Nazism, for example, and fascism, and they contributed to the changes in the society. They became a part of the solution. For example, the German churches, even though they collaborated with the Nazis, they became, after the World War II, a driving force for healing of the national psyche of Germany. Well, I don't know if this will be the case with the Russian Orthodox Church. Certainly, it contributes to Putinism, to the regime in Russia, in the same way as Deutsche Christen had contributed to Nazism in a very kind of supportive way. Where I don't know if the Russian Orthodox Church will be able to change its standing, its mind, and to repent as the German churches did after the World War II. I don't know. There is a chance, but it will not happen automatically. They need to be helped. They need to be facilitated to do so. So there is hope, but also a lot of work is needed. This hope to be materialized.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the room? I have one question about like the civil society and its engagement. I'm originally from Poland, and I think in that way, Polish people are not that different than Ukrainians, that when there is a time of crisis, we can mobilize and be active. The problem is when there is no immediate danger. So like my thought was, like, I don't know Ukrainian society that much, but like I know that in Poland, it could be the problem when, you know, there is a peace and there is this reconstruction process that then people become more like passive and so on. How do you think like this lesson of war and Maidans before, did they make Ukrainian civil society strong enough that they will stay active after the war during reconstruction when it will be, you know, not direct enemy, not direct danger, but need for like hard work for probably years or decades?
Well, absolutely. So I agree that the Polish society is also very strong in standing against totalitarianism. Let us remember the Warsaw riot, rebellion against the Germans, when the Poles stood until really the last soldier against the occupation. And then we should remember Solidarność, which was really a very important example of the resistance of the Polish people against totalitarianism. Well, I hope those traditions are not completely forgotten, even under the present circumstances. And yes, that's true that speaking about Ukraine, I believe the Ukrainian civil society is still very strong and will be controlling even the presidential authority or the state even in the period of reconstruction. We all know that Ukraine has faces a risk of corruption in the reconstruction, because there will be a lot of money coming to Ukraine from the international donors, and there will be a huge temptation by the authorities to abuse this money. We cannot hide this reality. It will be a reality. It is already a reality, because the reconstruction has started already, as it was mentioned, I think, by the ambassador. This society is very much looking carefully about on what the government is doing. For example, the recent resignations in the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine following some corruption scandals, they follow the whistleblowing from the civil society, from some journalist investigations. So the society is still very much in the control of what is going on in the country, and controlling not just the aggressor, but their own authorities, the presidential office and so forth. So yeah, I think it's like the most effective institution in the Ukraine society, in Ukraine, both during the war and after the war.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I would like to thank you very much, Professor, for this presentation and for bringing up so strongly that the reconstruction and is not only about like buildings and thing, and the piece is not only about like what politicians agree on, but like what the society wants and when society is active. So thank you very much for this presentation and for joining us today, and we wish you a very good day.
Thank you. My pleasure. All the best.
Bye.